and welcome to Roadmap 2023, our election issues and personalities tracking program. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. Thanks for being with us. On the program today, my guest says the incoming administration from May 29, 2023 will have to undertake a comprehensive review of the nation's security architecture, with thinking outside the box and involving federal, state, and local governments, as well as the private sector, to address root causes of insecurity instead of just symptoms. That's because my guest doesn't believe that higher personnel numbers, even more funding, or intelligence gathering on their own will make significant difference. Roadmap 2023 talks to Security and Risk Management Services consultant, a fellow of the Nigerian Institute of Industrial Security and managing director of PR24 Risk Management Consulting, Mr. Onyekachi Adekoya. Mr. Onyekachi Adekoya, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Ladi.
You are speaking to us today from Maiduguri, which is coincidentally one of the symbols or emblems of what many would describe as Nigeria's security situation over the last 8 years and today. And in that area, we have been inundated with tales of what had happened with Boko Haram. The federal government had claimed that significantly they've degraded Boko Haram, but there are many people who disagree with that, especially since it appears as if the insecurity had spread to other parts of the country. As it is today, and as we are preparing for a transition of government, what would you describe our current security situation as?
That's a very tough question to ask because in attempting to answer the question, we have to look at multiple angles to the problem. So in general assessment language, we will say that Nigeria is regarded to be a medium to extreme risk environment, depending on where you are and where you're traveling to. So that will be the immediate assessment of what the general threat environment in Nigeria is like, again, depending on where you are. In terms of how this outgoing administration has fared, I think that they made a promise to deal with the issue of Boko Haram. It's not yet Uhuru, but they fairly dealt with that issue to some extent. At the height of Boko Haram's insurgency against the Nigerian state, it held territory similar to the Satiro insurgency we had in 1906 in Sokoto. They held territory in some parts of the country. We can boldly say they no longer hold significant spaces. We can't claim to say that they have local governments under their control. We used to have 3 divisions in the northeast dealing with the issues of Boko Haram ISWAP. Today, there's been a drawdown in the number of divisions that we have here in the northeast dealing with some of these issues. So life has returned back to the northeast to a great extent. Maybe we still have pockets of places and spaces where they still find some leeway to operate. The problem is not as it once was. If we're looking at Boko Haram and ISWAP in the northeast theater alone, but if you then look at the happenings in the northwest, again, I pointed out to the fact that some of the things you see in the northwest have been there since the early 1990s, or 1905, 1906. So the issues of armed banditry, Mahadist type Islamic movements, Ansaru, banditry, they've been there for a very long time. And we are in a world where information travels faster, aided by social media. So some of these issues are coming to the fore. If you go in through the annals of history and some of the research work done, you will see issues about banditry that go way back as 40 years, 50 years. They've been there, they're entrenched, much like the wars you find in Europe, counter wars, and there are a number of reasons for some of these social upheavals. Now, the most unlikely part is what we now see happening in the North Central with the incursions of ISWAP in Kwara, in Niger, some parts of Benue, making threats to Ondo. That's a bit of an issue. The protests by the Southeasterners, which pretty much encapsulate the agitation of IPOB, ESN, MASOB, have been with us since the 1966 Civil War, so nothing new there. We can't even say that the agitations in the Niger Delta are also new. So, Ladi, if you ask the question, there are a whole lot of sides to look at to assess whether or not this administration has done fairly well within the 8 years that it has had. So on the issue of Boko Haram, yes, we would probably say on a scale of 1 to 10, perhaps they've done 7, because we must also be fair to the military, who every day put themselves in harm's way to keep Nigerians safe. So some work has been done, but there are a whole lot of issues to address.
That then brings me to the issue of the armed forces themselves. When you were responding, of course, you mentioned the fact that we need to be fair. And in being fair, there is the question of looking at equipping, welfare, and numbers. Numbers in terms of the numbers of personnel that are in these forces. Some of those I had spoken to who are actually members of the armed forces have pointed out that these 3 key issues have probably been the difference in many instances between success and failure. Now, from what you know, let's take the numbers, for example. Do we, as currently constituted, have adequate numbers to tackle the kind of security challenges that a country the size of Nigeria has? Because the incoming president has said that he is going to increase the number of personnel that Nigeria has.
Yes, Vladi, in terms of the military, I want to respectfully disagree with those who think that it's a numbers problem. No, it's not a numbers problem. With the police, yes, we have a numbers problem. We should have, by UN standards, minimum 500,000 policemen. And maybe we can come to those arguments as to how we can increase that numbers and have the right numbers. When you look at numbers, you can't turn the entirety of Nigeria into a military barracks. You can't flood the country with soldiers. The question is, what is driving this insecurity? What is driving the unrest? What is leading people to take up arms against the state? Because if you have 1 million soldiers or members of our armed forces, and you have the entirety of the 36 states of the Federation experiencing one form of unrest or the other, then your numbers argument will fall flat on its face. Remember that the army can do only as much as it can do within the context of a state that is stable. So if we talk about national security, we also make another mistake when we talk about national security. Because the term national security would mean something different to the Jaw nation, because they are a nation. It will mean something different to the Yoruba nation agitators, or to the Hausawa nation, or to the Fulani nation. So there are different nations, ethnic nationalities within the grouping called Nigeria. And so national security speak itself is not what it should be. So when we talk about human security, we begin to define some other issues. So it's not a numbers thing, because you can't keep throwing numbers at the problem. There is a deep-seated problem, and I do hope that this incoming administration would dial back the rhetoric of always using force or considering force as a first option. We must begin to look at other soft power projection options that we have. We now begin to look at the societal fabric itself. What are the drivers of unrest? We may need to go back to the definition of what security is. You know, security at a very base level just means the absence of threat, the presence of peace and lack of conflict. So what are the things that will lead to the breakdown of peace, conflict, issues of social order, social justice, access to resources at the very base level, You know, so those are the issues that we need to begin to tackle. Because if we keep saying we throw more personnel at it, more equipment at it, we may not be looking at long-term sustainability in our approach. So yes, we have a constraint of personnel. Yes, the military, the police are doing the best that they can do, but there is a deeper Nigerian problem that has to be addressed, and it will not be resolved by mere means of arms or personnel.
Which would then mean, if I take it from that, what you would probably extend that argument to is that probably means that funding may not actually be the problem that many think it is as well. Am I right?
Okay, so funding should not be our problem. And I just give you a good case in point. The value, because when people talk about funding and they say that Nigeria is running into a debt of about 77 trillion naira as we speak, the total value of our gas reserve as a nation, and this can be checked also, is we have gas reserve valued at over $803 trillion. Let me repeat. Nigeria has, and this is just only natural gas, over $803 trillion worth of proven gas reserves that we have. So Nigeria should not be a country that has a funding problem. So we shouldn't have the funding problem, but because of the structural issues we have, and because of the way we play our politics, because of the centrifugal forces that arm themselves up against the state, we are not able to focus on the enormous potentials that we have as a country. So there is a lot of sit down that must happen. And Ladi, let me just stop being theoretical. There's conflict everywhere. There's conflict between the local government and the state government. There is conflict between the state government and the federal government. There's conflict between the traditional rulers and the local government and the state governments. There's conflict between the judiciary and the executive. There's conflict between the legislative arm and the judiciary sometimes, and even the executive mostly. So there's conflict everywhere. We just have a contraption of ethnic nationalities created by colonial fiat. And what we fail to realize is that the military rule suppressed some of the agitations over the years. So at the turn of the Fourth Republic, with the experience of democracy, what people could not vent, they could eventually begin to vent and find a way to express some of those issues. And the conflicts that we see within society begin to air themselves to the fore. So Nigeria is faced with what we classically call a wicked problem. And a wicked problem manifests in the fact that you don't have one simple approach to solving it. It cannot just be a funding problem. It cannot just be said to be a personnel problem. It cannot just be said to be an equipment problem. Whilst you have some of those factors acting as contributors to the crisis we see, but there is a deep-seated problem. So yes, there is a funding problem, but no, there should not be a funding problem.
Something that seems to tie everything you've said, particularly even at the level of conflicts between everybody, in the system, is intelligence. People like you tell me all the time that most of the security breaches and security incidents that we have in Nigeria are mostly a failure of intelligence gathering, intelligence evaluation, and then, deploying the information gathered from intelligence into action. But on the other hand, we have so many agencies that are supposed to be gathering intelligence. I don't know how many they are, but I know that as a layman, I know that we talk about the DSS, we talk of the National Intelligence Agency, we talk about the various arms of the military having their own individual intelligence agencies. The police has its intelligence arm, and so on. And yet, people like you tell us that we have an intelligence problem. Can you square that for those of us who are not security experts?
Ladi, it depends on what intelligence you are looking at. Because when you look at when you look at matters of how you project national interests, whether in the defense, intelligence, military, or economic domain, intelligence is also information. So, and within the information domain, there's also propaganda. Propaganda can be positive or it can be negative, and then we then begin to talk about influence operations. So what you say intelligence, if you say in the layman's technology, is just that you are talking about actionable intelligence. A matter is about to occur or looks likely to occur, and analysts have assessed and provided the agencies to act with actionable intelligence. You then come to the issue of what do you do with intelligence? You then look at the deep-seated problem that we have in Nigeria. So maybe a Yoruba man is seated and he has intelligence that if the state acts, it may be to the detriment, for example, of certain sentiments which he holds there. The question is, would he act in the interest of the Nigerian state as against the Yoruba nation? Or you can flip that to, say, the Eastern person or a Fulani person or a Bra person or whichever. So it's how we define how to act. The man at the shop floor sends up the intelligence and he has to wait for somebody in Abuja for them to give the go-ahead. So do we have an intelligence problem? No, we do not have an intelligence problem, Ladi. We don't have. The DSS has its personnel in every local government in Nigeria. The National Orientation Agency also has its personnel in every local government in Nigeria. So we don't have an intelligence problem by any stretch of the imagination. We have the NIA, we have the DIA, which is Defense Intelligence Agency, and we have the Department of State Services. These three agencies were brought by Decree 4 in 1985-1986 by then Head of State Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, who morphed the National Security Organization into three distinct agencies and then formed the office of the ONSA, which is the office of the NSA. The security advisor to the and the coordinating officer for intelligence for this country is known, and that person is the president of the NSA. We don't have an intelligence problem, I can tell you for free. If you know where to look, there's OSINT. OSINT is open source intelligence. Some of the media houses also have intelligence. If you have people in every local government, you have operatives in deep field locations, you can have that intelligence. So we have intelligence, but when we talk about the structural problems, the will to act, the capacity to act, the capability to act, the framework within which that action must take place. What are the consequences for failure in security? And how do we interpret values of human life within that national security strategy which we published in 2019, when we said the Nigerian state will now begin to focus on the ideals of human security. Okay, and so we have intelligence. We do have intelligence, but we also lack intelligence. And intelligence in this space has to be information. What information are we putting out there to the agencies? What information are we putting out there to the Nigerian public? How are we, and sometimes we think we shouldn't maybe incentivize the people to collaborate with government, what you call an all of government approach, or also all of people approach. Mm-hmm. So how do you use information to elicit support from the Nigerian people, get their buy-in, such that trust is restored between the Nigerian state and the nationalities that make up this space called Nigeria, so that the people can become a force multiplier to whatever number, equipment, or policies you have in place, because you can't take security in isolation. So intelligence is a problem, yes, but then intelligence is not a problem. The problem is, how do we intelligently begin to address the issues of security, taking a bottom-to-top approach? But leadership must be provided from the top.
That brings up the question about collaboration, because when you talk about, for example, the DIA, the NIA, and the DSS, these are three agencies. Then you've got the police, you've got the Security and Civil Defense Corps. You've got other agencies which are paramilitary in nature, but which are spread right across the country. Customs, immigration, the airports. You've got airport police and all of that. Now, I'm wondering that collaboration and synergy between these agencies perhaps is why all the information which you referenced earlier is being produced is not being turned into actionable information which prevents security breaches. And we have seen many examples. Take, for example, the Kuje prisons, the attack on Kuje prisons. There were agencies that knew that Kuje prisons was going to be attacked. It's just that somehow in the shuffle, nobody bothered to inform the Nigerian Correctional Services, which runs Kuje prisons. But there were several people who knew that attacks were being planned on Kuje prisons. So is that a one-off, or is it a real issue?
It comes back to the issue of intelligence. And this time we'll talk about institutional intelligence. The question is, we have over maybe 20-something agencies with responsibility for security. Who are they working for? Are they working for the Nigerian people? Are they working for the Nigerian state? Or are they working for the Nigerian president? So if they are working and they think that their job is to please the Nigerian president, then there will be a lot of showboating on the part of the different agencies. So it's all about, again, institutional intelligence. Who are you working for? What are you set up to do? What are the mandates given to your organization? And sometimes deliberately also, there are layers that overlap and intersect between agencies of state. For example, the DSS can also effect an arrest, but we argue that the police should be the lead agency for responsibility for security within the Nigerian space. For example, again, just I think 3 days ago, 2 days ago, the Defense HQ was seen issuing out a statement on the threat to the inauguration on May 29th. Should the defense headquarters be making a comment in the first instance? When we say that in a democracy, not in military rule, the police should be the lead agency. So we would have expected that, if there was a threat, maybe an alert to be issued by the DSS, worst case, the police will come out to make a statement, not the defense headquarters. So you see that we have agencies set up. Initially, we set up because we had money, and money wasn't a problem, so we can employ people. And so we employed all sorts of people into these agencies. We didn't do like a system audit to link and have a proper a handshake between the agencies. If you mention the Kuje prison attack, who do you blame in the Kuje prison attack? Do you blame the correctional services? Do you blame the Minister of Interior? Do you blame the DSS? Do you blame the Army? Who do we begin to blame? Because if you face the Minister of Interior, he will tell you it's a budget problem. Yes, risk assessment had been done a couple of times at the Kuje prisons, several times. But the correction measures identified arguably were not implemented, a budget problem. Would you blame the DSS that had information, or the military intelligence that had the information, or the commander who perhaps assessed that the risk to him and his personnel was too great and they were not able to confront and therefore made a tactical withdrawal from scene? So who do we begin to blame for some of the issues that we have? We cannot begin to point fingers at one party or the other. I think that the problem we have is systemic, as it is a character failure, but importantly, our national orientation towards security is the bigger challenge. Because people make laws on security, they don't understand much about security. People adjudicate without understanding issues, and you have the executive will make very interesting appointments into certain critical offices. So there's a lot of things that we need to completely rework. We must not rush into the siloed thinking of it's people, it's equipment, it's money. No, the problem is quite deep-seated.
Let's look at because when you talk about systemic issues, what comes to my mind is that many of the security agencies, in fact, virtually all of the security agencies, are federal in orientation. But we also have state governors as chief security officers of their individual jurisdictions. But they have no control of any of the security agencies, either for intelligence gathering or for law enforcement or indeed any other thing. Now, this has continued to be a recurring decimal with the governors and, for example, local government chairmen complaining that, look, I'm supposed to be the chief security officer of this area, but I have no information, I have no forces, I have no enforcement powers, and yet I have this responsibility. Now, in that kind of scenario, given the background that you have given already about personnel, funding, collaboration, and synergy, where does this come into that? Because this is actually something that politically a lot of people are looking forward to having a debate and maybe even a serious argument over under the next administration.
Very fantastic question, Ladi. So, prior to independence or before the Civil War, Nigeria had a native police. Or before then, you had the emirs, the obas, the obis that had their prisons, had their police, and had local system that worked. Of course, you know that before the Civil War, we operated a confederation. But fast forward, Nigeria now operates a unitary system. If somebody slaps me, as an example, I have to do the federal police the dishonor of having to attend to that matter. Not saying that assault is a small crime. Or if I lose my generator, my Tiger Gen, and I can't find it, I have to go and inform the federal police that I can't find my generator. This is how funny our current setup is. Completely laughable. But there's hope. Because all the major parties campaigned on restructuring the policing system to give back policing powers back to the states. Remember that the federal government of Nigeria does not own or control land based on the Land Use Act. The power of land is vested in the states and in the state governors. If the federal government does not control or own land, and land belongs to the people to the people and whose powers they have then transferred to a governor appointed to hold that in trust for the entirety of the state, it should follow that security should be local. And the person who has the land, who represents the people who own the land, should be able to, at very minimal level, enforce certain laws within the space it controls. So that's why I said there is conflict everywhere. If we continue to look at the Nigerian security space as how many people this happened, and we talk about, I could talk to you about the symptoms. We could discuss the symptoms all day long. 2 people kidnapped, 35 insurgents killed, ISWAP here, Boko Haram there. No, we can talk about this all day long. But there are systemic conflicts everywhere. So, what is the way forward? And I do hope that the incoming administration would consider this. It's time for state police. Yes, it may be abused, as the federal police has also been abused in time past by different presidents. I don't want to mention their name. So let's run a pilot. Can we consider running a pilot? The states that want and are ready to implement state police, can we have a number of states, maybe 5, maybe 10, that are ready? Because also you must be ready and you can fund. So let's run a pilot system with state police. Okay? 2, can we review weapons classification for this state police? Police should not carry, in any case, AK-47. Those are dangerous assault rifles, makes them unapproachable in the eyes of the public. So, can the state police be limited to service pistols only? And in some instances, double barrel. Can we retain the Mopo squadrons that we have? And I could talk about the Mopo squadrons all day, but a case for another day. Such that when the police goes to deal with the issue of Tiger generator and just normal misdemeanors and the rest, if there is a case where you need superior firepower, then the federal police can be brought in while the state police will condor off the area. can we consider something that works? Because as long as you separate the man from his land, there will be agitations, there will be unrest. Because sometimes people also don't trust the federal police. If the man there is from another nationality, and there's a matter between two nationalities, again, there can be some issues of where does your allegiance lie. And if something happens, the man can be moved to another place. So we need to rework and take policing back to the local level. And when we say local, the local governments also have a responsibility. Which brings me to the other issue of conflict. The state governors in some states are not allowing the local governments the leeway to do what they have to do. There's a resource conflict there. The state governments in turn have issues with the federal government. There's also a resource problem because if you look at what you have in the exclusive list, there's so much. I just talked about why we shouldn't have a money problem. $803 trillion worth of proven gas reserve. Nigeria has a lot of base metals, different mineral resources, good arable land for agriculture. I mean, I'm shocked every time they talk about the Ukraine-Russian grain deal and how that will affect global food security when most of our land is arable land. So we have a lot to do, but because of the way the society is structured, we scramble and scramble within ourselves for pittance. So the local government, the state government, the federal government have to deal with resource issues. The issues of security is not cheap. So when you talk about security, you also talk about the quality of the personnel, the training and the welfare of the personnel. These things cost money. So until we completely rework our psychic as a country and rework our posture to taking issues to local levels, in any case, the Boko Haram, the ISWAP, the ESN, these issues of crime happen in the local governments, not in the state capitals, not even in the federal capital territory, but within remote local governments. So can you see the gap?
Yeah.
We need to fix that gap to be able to address some of these issues. And yes to state policing, but yes to broader issues beyond state policing, because the issues are beyond that.
We are now looking at, because you mentioned the document, the National Strategic Security Review, which I believe was carried out not too long ago. I'm not exactly sure of the year now, but I think it was 2019, exactly. Now, it's 4 years old, if it was 2019, and there are those who would say that, you know, with the incoming administration, it's due for a review. I'm going to ask you about what elements should be in that review, if indeed there should be a review. But I want to also ask you first about the role of private security. Because most of Nigeria, corporate Nigeria, for example, is being guarded, you know, essentially by private security. You have all kinds of vigilante groups, private security companies offering security for residences, estates, and all of that, where the police or other security agencies cannot cover, you know. And that aspect seems to be missing. The private security companies, of which I'm told there are thousands of them, employing possibly millions of decommissioned servicemen of various types and of various ranks, are completely left out almost of the security arrangement and of the security loop. They don't have a place in the framework. Is this a big omission?
I think that the conversations around private security would come. But before we get to that point, even the military finds itself out of place. You train a military to shoot to kill, not to be involved with internal security issues. So our military today have been grossly over-domesticated. So they crowd out the space for the police. And the police, in turn, because the military seems to be, even by policy, lead agency for security, the police, in turn, have come to crowd out the space of the private players. You have the NSCDC that should regulate the private players. Themselves, sometimes we see cases of the police arresting NSCDC and some skirmishes like that. They also begin to crowd the space of the private players. And while all this, forgive my French, shenanigans is going on, you have foreign operators who have no license, who have no business, in any case, operating security in Nigeria, sneaking, and operate very quietly, and we have a lot of loss of revenue within the space. So there's a problem, Ladi. There's a big problem. There's a big problem. I hope I'm not sounding like a prophet of, but there's a problem.
No, that's what this conversation is about.
As we look at this, So what I hope to see is, I want to see the state governors come down to a roundtable, a sincere roundtable, and I hope that the president-elect can facilitate that session on security, bring in independent thinkers, call a KPMG or any of the consulting majors, for example, to facilitate that session of frank talk on security, what must be done. You see, the governors are on ground. They know the problems in the states. And have a discussion. Let that discussion be facilitated by an independent person. Not somebody with a background to the military, or because sometimes you first fall back to your constituency, as we like to call it in Nigeria. Let's have frank discussions on, and you will see, as I always say, security matters are just common sense issues. Simple common sense issues. We talk about the human security value that we espouse, pretty much. It's just been espoused in the country. But you cannot do human security without a stable economy. You cannot do human security without functioning infrastructure. You cannot do human security without education being the bedrock upon which you drive economic development, not even economic growth, because economic development and economic growth are two different aspects, but they say both about the same thing. Economic development deals with the quality of growth. And you cannot drive quality growth without education. Look at Pakistan and India. India producing an Indian origin prime minister in the UK, Pakistan a Scottish prime minister. There's an Irish person who's also Pakistani, if I'm not wrong. And that's all because if you look at India, China, Pakistan, they had a very deliberate policy towards addressing the issue of education and getting a very good workforce. Nigeria has everything good going for it. Over 220 million people projected to outgrow America with a young and vibrant population. Japan now has more death rate than growth rate. The France protest you see going on is that France, for every person that is working, they have one person, I think for every 1.7 person working, they have one person in retirement. Before it used to be for every one person working, for every 5 person working, they had one person in retirement. So that's why you see that they had to do their Pension Reform Act. Our growth rate is good. We're experiencing a commodity super cycle, and Nigeria is a commodity a powerhouse of commodities. So we don't have any reason why we should not be unlocking full potential. And you cannot achieve economic prosperity without security. So we must look at what are the drivers of insecurity. Have those frank conversations, look for the approach that is sensible, that is local, and then begin to drive it. Okay, so that is how you begin to fix some of these issues going forward, Ladi. And for me, I do hope that, without sounding immodest, that also that the politicians that we bring into power, we can begin to take them through the National Institute for Policy in Kuru, to take them on a training, mandatory training on issues of national interest, national defense, and national security. Again, I would say that national security defined this time as the security of the Nigerian state and its people. Because there are points where you have to, take something on your chin just for national interest. And there are times when you do not allow sabotage because of national interest. There are times when you look at the essentials of backward integration of the things you import the most, and insisting in some bilateral deals to protect your national interests. Because having your industries working will help your people gain meaningful employment, which will take off some people off the streets, and with economic prosperity, people tend to live a more sensible life within the construct of society. So we can begin to view our social contracts with the people differently, our contracts with our bilateral partners differently, when people who have the authority to act on our behalf have a better sense of place in our pursuit for a prosperous and for a more rewarding Nigeria for everybody. So there are plenty things to unpack. So this whole thing of here and there is not really the bigger problem. The deep-seated problem is that we are not running a program for the Nigerian people, a program for the Nigerian states that will in turn inform policy, inform government action, inform government thinking, and then you then have positive propaganda going out to the schools, to the primary schools, to the universities, to enthrone truly and truly the true virtues of being a patriotic Nigerian. And our problems with insecurity will not be resolved in the next 10 to 20 years. I want to say this also modestly, because sometimes in Nigeria we like the fire brigade quick fix approach. We must now begin to take a systemic approach to dealing with the issues of national security, national defense, and national interest. On national defense, when you talked about private sector and government sector, Ladi, I want to stop here, but just to say very briefly, the war in Russia-Ukraine is teaching us so many things. Look at the development of innovation in America, in the East, in Russia. It is not driven by government. Nigeria has the Defense Industries Corporation Act that set up DICON and says DICON has the sole mandate for everything security and defense. What an aberration in the 21st century. I mean, we need to unlock that space also and bring in private players so that we can fuel innovation and people can fund research. What are we talking about? We are talking about different, there's now satellite laser system to kill satellites. People are now taking the domain of warfare to space and getting fully prepared. China, Russia leading. So there's so much to unpack, but because the federal government is doing too much, we are dropping the ball at subtle places, and the nuance to national interest, national security and development is not what it should be. We are missing so much opportunity. That's what I want to be the emphasis of my conversation this morning.
Now, as we begin to wind down this discussion, I want to talk about international collaborations, because that would be the final point. You mentioned Russia, China, and so it's an appropriate point to bring in international collaboration. Nigeria is surrounded by French-speaking countries, and we speak English here as our official language. That immediately introduces some kind of barriers. But there are those who say that even in our strategic review, we are not approaching our neighbors and their security issues from a systemic perspective. So we are reacting rather than, being proactive. In Chad, in Niger, in Cameroon, in Benin Republic, and so on, that we are not. Is that true? And if so, how do we push past that?
Yeah, Ladi, I think we've now gone into the domain of geopolitics and international politics and international diplomacy. The French language is not a barrier, because within our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have linguists who speak French very fluently. So language is not a barrier, but within that domain of what we consider the African space, there's a whole lot of politicking that has to go on. But Africa cannot also completely decide for itself. That's to say, Africa is not free from external influence. To deal with the issue of national interest, let's even look at the US's Monroe Doctrine, where the US says that everything within its immediate hemisphere of the Americas is domain of national interest, and therefore the US would act to protect its national. Remember, I came again back to the issue of national interest.
Indeed.
For you to be able to speak up on issues that you think that affect your national interest, you must have a very stable defense sector. And you must also be able to pack a punch to back your international diplomacy with some words where they know you are no pushover. For example, Turkey is a member of NATO, but it irritates NATO at every point, slightest opportunity it gets. But Turkey is no pushover, not even to the Americans or to the Russians, to the Iranians or to anybody. And then Turkey can play its regional politics as it seems fit, in pursuit of its own national interests. We come back again to national interest. I'm not sure who Nigeria can back at in West Africa comfortably, or even in Africa. So you see, when we talk about dime, again, I talked about dime, defense is also very important. Defense, your defense sector, your ability to defend yourself, to project force, to also protect your national interests wherever it may be, is also very important when you begin to come into the domain of great power politics. So when you talk about great power politics, we can start with Africa being our domain. Time it was when if Nigeria would, for example, the crisis in Sudan, all Nigeria had to do was to land a contingent of some of our fine, gallant officers at the airport in Khartoum. And then without firing a shot, the parties will understand that they should go to the negotiating table. Similar to the days of ECOMOG and the African Union Peacekeeping Force. You don't hear about those anymore, do you?
No.
So times are changing. Our foreign policy posture must also begin to change. But we must have a veritable defense industry to help us project force and protect national interests within the Sahel. I'm hoping that everyone would, again, let's forget about this siloed approach. There's so much value where the world is experiencing some serious seismic shock, and the tables are turning to favor commodity superpowers. And Nigeria has every opportunity at this time to become a major player, you know, in global politics, and to have a seat at the table, even at the UN Permanent Security Council table. So maybe I do hope that the incoming administration, of course, I've listened to the president-elect. He's been quite tactful in his use of word. So let's see what we get. But we need to have more thinkers. The private sector is also not excluded. In other developed economies, you have think tanks that are privately funded, okay, or to research on policy issues, to research on issues of national security as can impact on the Nigerian state. Because if you don't have a functioning, protected Nigerian state, you can also pursue value. So the private sector is also to call them out to say, okay, we in the private sector must begin to get a bit more involved in funding some institutes, think tanks, where we can all have a sit down. You can bring members of the academia, members in the international affairs, in the defense, in private, and have a think tank where we occasionally sit down to review where we are, where we want to be, and then come up with policy suggestions, and even have workshops and seminars where we can begin to properly inundate the politicians on the essence of national interest and pursuing national security to fuel economic development and prosperity. So the issues of near neighbor diplomacy is not completely bad, but we are constrained a bit by non-alignment policy, which we had when we had a bipolar world. But the world today is going multipolar. Before the Second World War ended, we were multipolar. The Second World War ended, we entered into a bipolar world. Bipolar world ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We entered a unipolar world. A multipolar world is coming, and it's almost at foot. And the question is, as a commodity powerhouse, how is Nigeria shaping? Because if we are not shaping, then we have foreign influence operators who are also shaping for some influence operations against the Nigerian state. And I wouldn't want to say more than that. So we need to be a bit more strategic. Our big brother policy in Africa is not enough. We need to think deeply. We need to think more forward about the country, and then begin to align our resources. We have the best brains. Some of the best brains in the world, to be modest, and we can think and think our way out of some of the problems that we have, and even become. It's my vision to see Nigeria become a net exporter of some military capabilities to whole of Africa and even to some parts of Europe. Track Force and Innocent is already doing that, but there are some spaces where we need to begin to get into to be able to project national interest better.
Indeed. One would expect that even as we continue with this series of agenda setting for the incoming administration, this one on security in particular will hit a home run with the incoming president-elect and his government. Onyenkachi Adekoya, thank you so very much for your time on the program today. It's been a pleasure having you from our Maiduguri studios.
Thank you so very much, Ladi, and I do hope that you will visit Maiduguri anytime very soon.
I will indeed. Thank you so very much. That's our program today. We would, of course, like to hear from you on the conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and watch previous episodes of the program via our podcast and YouTube pages. Please visit our website, channelstv.com, to get started. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. Goodbye.